you're going to have to write. No, we won't be able to get through this, but I want to kind of cover this tonight. So instead of, we're going to get ready to go into chapter 5. But chapter 5 is talking about the scroll, the lamb who takes the scroll, right? So it's talking about that. So Sheila and I were talking, and then we taught on this before, and maybe some of you might have been here, and most of you probably weren't. But what I kind of want to cover tonight is the genealogies of Christ. How many have heard that before? The two genealogies. There's two genealogies, one in Matthew, one in Luke. And so we want to cover those because we want to see how Christ qualifies through, which we're going to see, through the royal line and through the bloodline to be the King of Kings. Okay? And so we're going to kind of cover that, which actually then will take us into chapter 5 of Revelation, which is about the Lamb who, you know, it talks about they couldn't find no one worthy to take the scroll, right? And so basically it kind of just leads into that. So let's see through these two genealogies about Christ. And so we'll cover them. So first, let's go over to Deuteronomy chapter 17. So, and while you're turning there, Deuteronomy 17. And so while the Old Testament doesn't explicitly mention bloodline and legal in the same way we understand them, right, through earthly monarchies, it does lay out specific requirements and principles for a king in Israel, which we'll see in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And so, these requirements touch upon the aspects that could be seen, which relate to a king through the royal line, okay, and what God required. All right, everybody there, chapter 17, Deuteronomy. So we're going to start in verse 17. Okay, so there's certain things that we're going to read. So 17, let's read 17 through the end. Well, let's not read it. I'm just going to kind of cover. Okay, the first thing is, which we'll see in verse 17, is it must be chosen by God, okay? A king must be chosen by God. Was Christ chosen by God? Everybody, that should have been one unanimous. Yeah. Yes. Everybody was looking down. I guess. Hello, when you look down, that doesn't mean your ears get plugged up. All right. Was Jesus chosen by God? Okay. In Deuteronomy 15, sorry. 50, did I say 17? In 15. Okay. Well, 17, yeah. 17. We'll get to that one. But we're in 17:15. It actually starts in 14, but yeah. Who's on first? Okay, 14. When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Okay, so now that really doesn't have nothing to do with what we're talking about. So in verse 15, it does say that a king must be chosen by God, right? You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. Okay, so that's all we're going to cover because we got a lot to cover. So there we say that the Lord your God chooses. So king must be chosen by God. Okay, everybody got that? Okay, he must be an Israelite. Okay, verse 15, it says, from among your fellow Israelites. Okay, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren, you shall set as a king over you. Okay, you may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So it must be an Israelite. Was Jesus an Israelite? Yes? Okay, everybody with me? Everybody okay? All right. Verse 16, okay, not to multiply horses. Did Jesus multiply horses? Hello? Everybody there? Are you looking at the same verses I'm looking at? Yeah, verse 16, right? Verse 16. Okay? You shouldn't, a king cannot multiply horses like Solomon did, right? So a king cannot multiply horses. Did Jesus multiply horses? Okay, good. All right. Verse 17. Everybody there? Okay. Not multiply wives. Okay, it says it in 17, right? That's why you're going to have to write some of this down and go back and look over this. Okay? All right. And why was it not? Well, we see that with Solomon, right? Because it was to prevent the influence of foreign religious practices and maintain devotion to God, which Solomon did not, because he had, 700 wives and 300 concubines. Right? Thousands. Okay. Verse 17, we're still in 17. Not to accumulate excessive wealth. Okay? Jesus didn't do that either. Okay? This is what the king chosen by God was not to do, right? Not to accumulate excessive wealth. Okay? And then the next one in verse 18 and 19. Okay? He was to study and obey God's law. Okay? Also, it should be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of the law in a book from one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and to be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes. Okay, so he was to study and obey God's law. Jesus did that, right? Okay, then the last one in verse 20, it talks about that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left. He was to have humility. Did Christ exhibit that? All right, good. So we covered that. What the requirements from God are for a king. All right, so we're going to connect the term, the bloodline and the royal line, through the two different genealogies. Okay, so just kind of want to cover that, because that's important to know what was a requirement of God for a king. Okay, now we'll go over to the New Testament. We'll start in Matthew chapter 1. We know that there's two different genealogies in Matthew, and so it's good. That's why they're in there, because they're actually facts. They're historical records, how things go back. Okay, Matthew 1, starting in verse 1. Okay. All right, so a lot of times these two genealogies, there been a discussion, and people are confused sometimes by them because of the way they're worded, especially I think over in Luke. But we're going to kind of cover this, all right? And we're going to see that through one genealogy, which is Matthew, we're going to see here that it runs through Joseph, okay, to his adopted father. And then Luke is going to go through, the genealogy goes through Mary, okay? So one's a royal line and one's a bloodline, okay? Everybody got that? They're both, we're going to see this, just so you know, they both descend from Solomon. Both Joseph and Mary, the parents of Jesus, both descend from Solomon, okay? All right, so let's look at the genealogy in Matthew real quick. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, the son of Abraham. Okay, see where this starts? Abraham. Okay, Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah and Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon. Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah, who was Bathsheba. Solomon begot Rehoboam. Rehoboam begot Abijah. Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat begot Joram. And Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham. Jotham begot Ahaz. And Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Manasseh begot Ammon. And Ammon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel. And Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begot Abud, whatever. Abihud begot Eliakim. And Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim. And Achim begot Eliud. Eliud begot Eleazar. And Eleazar begot Mathan. Mathan begot Jacob. Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Okay, so we see there that goes through Joseph's genealogy because Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary. Okay, so we see this line goes from Abraham. So this is to the Jews. So really, this is the Jewish line from. So this is kind of what, when you see the two different genealogies, this one is going from Abraham, who the Jews say is their father, right? Because we see that over in the scriptures where the Pharisees said, you know, Abraham is our father, and we've never been under bondage. It's like, that's a lie in the first place at Jesus' time, because you were in bondage for 70 years, then you were in bondage under the Egyptians. I mean, it's like, how could you say that? It's like, we were never in bondage, really? But anyway, so we see that they claim Abraham as their father. And so we see the genealogy in Matthew goes from Abraham, okay? It highlights the royal line of David, okay? Proving he's the king of the Jews themselves, okay? So we see that. Everybody with me? Okay, well, let's go over to John 8:33 real quick, because I got that highlighted. There was something about that that I want to point out. John 8:33. Oh, yeah, which is that kind of which I just mentioned over there. So this is basically descendants from Abraham to Jesus, because, you know, point out, which is, you know, evidence that they claimed Abraham as their father, because we see here when Jesus is talking to them about the truth, it says in verse 33, John 8:33, they answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been in bondage to anyone." That just blows me away, because it's funny. Anyway, it's funny because they were in bondage. They're in bondage right now under the Romans. So they say they've never been in bondage. Then they were in bondage in Babylon for 70 years. Then they were in bondage to the Egyptians. So it's like, you were never in bondage to anyone. Anyway, so that's how they tried to answer Jesus. But anyway, so you see that they're saying that they're descendants of Abraham. Okay? All right. So, all right. So this demonstrates, yes. Well, yeah. Ishmael is, all the Muslims are under Ishmael. So, no, because Abraham was the one that God called out of Ur to follow him. So he was the initial one that God called. Right. Okay. So what's the question? It says he begot Isaac. So basically that lineage goes down from Abraham through Isaac down to Joseph. So not Ishmael. Yeah. So we're good there. Huh? Ishmael is from Hagar. Yeah. But we're not talking about him. That's a whole other people. Okay. We're talking about the Jews. Okay, so we see there. So all right, everybody with me there? That's Joseph's genealogy. Okay. So we see that we come down, and even when you get to David, okay, let's go back to David. Okay, David the king begot Solomon. Okay, so we see that Joseph comes through the line of Solomon, going back to Abraham for the Jews, for purpose of the Jews. Okay, but we see that he comes through the line of Solomon, and Solomon was who? He was a king under David. Well, David had more sons, but which we're going to see over in Luke. But so Solomon was the king that actually got that God said that he would build the temple and everything else, and that his line would come through Solomon, would reign forever. Do we need to go there and see that? Okay. Okay, let's go there. So nobody wants to answer. 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel. Second Samuel chapter 7. Okay, 2 Samuel. All right, so 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. Okay. Everybody there? 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. Okay, God makes a covenant with David because David wanted to build a house, right? A temple for God. But God said, nope, you've been too many wars, too much bloodshed. You're not going to do it, but your descendant will build me a house, okay? So in verse 12, he says, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, and he's talking to David here, I will set up your seed after you who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, so this is another thing for us. Remember when I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. And that happened to Israel a lot, right? But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Okay, so we see there that the Lord promised that David's throne would be forever, and so that's under Solomon. So Joseph, the father of Jesus, is under the line of Solomon. Okay, from Abraham, which dealing with the Jews, but he's under the line of Solomon, who is established forever as a king, right? That line. So he's under there. And so that's the royal line. Okay, everybody with me? Okay, let's go over to Luke then. Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3, starting in verse 23. Okay, there's a lot of names in here because this one goes all the way back to Adam, but it's every three sets of 14 generations. Okay, so so it doesn't like list all of them back, every single one all the way back to Adam, because that would be a long list, but it does cover the main ones through. So let's look at a couple of things. Okay, so verse 23, let's read that. It says, now Jesus himself began his ministry at about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mathat, and then it goes on, okay? And then let's go down Okay, let's go down to verse 31. Right there. The son of Maliah, the son of Menon, the son of Mattatha, the son of Nathan, the son of David. Okay, so now we had Solomon over there from David that comes down, right? And here we have Nathan, okay, which is the son of David. So that's David's other son. Solomon was David's son, right? Through the royal line that God said your throne would be forever. Now we have the David and then the son Nathan. It's coming through this line, okay? This is the bloodline. That's why we see in verse 23, it says, as was supposed. So basically, this is like, they're still mentioned because we know women weren't like tallied in the census and stuff. So it had to be the men. So as was supposed is actually the father-in-law, Joseph's father-in-law, which was Mary's dad. Okay? Everybody with me? Yeah, so this is Mary's side. So we had Matthew going up to Abraham, which is, actually pertains to the Jews, but it comes through Solomon, and God said that his kingdom would rule forever. And now which through Solomon, now this one is through Nathan, well, all the way up to Adam. It's important to realize it goes back up to Adam, all the way down through David again, but then to Nathan, the other son of David. Okay, everybody with me? Yeah, that's where the Y splits, or however you want to look at it. You got Adam, and then all of a sudden it splits off. You got Solomon, and then you got Nathan. They're brothers, and then it goes down to Joseph and to Mary. Okay, so you have two different genealogies. They're not the same. They're two different ones. One's a royal line, which is Solomon, and then the other is the bloodline. Okay? Now, and you can kind of go up there and you see it basically in verse 38 goes all the way to Adam. Okay? And who is the son of God, right? So we see how it's traced all the way down, and that as was supposed, that's the key to telling us that it's actually not Joseph's bloodline. It's actually Mary's, but we see that the women were part of the census back then, and so that's why it has that. So we see that, but this is actually Mary's bloodline. It's her descendants. It's her dad. If you put Joseph out of sight, it's her family all the way up to Adam. Okay, everybody understand that? Good. Questions? What? Well, because like I said, back then, census, over in Matthew, they do list 4 women, but Matthew did that for a reason, but for whatever reason, Luke, he's a detailed kind of guy. He, maybe they did this, I don't know. I don't know why, other than that a lot of times the women weren't taken as far as the census. When they took the census, just like when the Egyptians left, they say there's about 3 million who left, but actually there was probably more because they didn't count the women and children, and so there's a lot more, and so. Right, yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about. They weren't counted in as part of that. So, all right. Yeah, so, okay. All right, so everybody good? See that? Any questions? All right. So we see now that Jesus qualifies through the royal line of Joseph because he's adopted. When somebody's adopted, what does that mean? Huh? They receive all the benefits of a bloodline, right? So he was adopted by Joseph, and so that means he meets the royal line. He qualifies and meets the standard of the royal line. Of course, he was born of Mary, so he now also meets the bloodline. Okay? And it goes back to Adam because now we know that he qualifies to be over the entire world. King of Kings, over the entire world. So it traces it back to Adam, which is showing that he's, you know, he lines up with the entire world. He's over the entire world. Everybody understand that? Good with that? All right. Okay, so there is one thing also that I want to cover, because if we go back, if we go back to, and I want to see, show you how this is how God is. Okay, if we go back to Matthew, let's just go back to Matthew real quick, because there's an issue with the genealogy in Matthew. Okay, and we need to show you this is how God works everything perfectly. Okay, there's an issue with one of the descendants of in that line. Okay, so in all right, let's see. That is okay, in verse 12, Matthew chapter 1, verse 12, okay? All right, so here's a name you need to pay attention to, because this is what we're going to kind of cover right now. After they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Okay, that name Jeconiah, we're going to go over to there. Let's go over to Jeremiah. So this poses a problem on the surface for Jesus. Okay, Jeremiah chapter 22. All right. Everybody there? Okay. No, 20. Okay, everybody there? Jeremiah 22, verse 28. Okay. Now you're going to see this name's different spelled here, but just like you see, if we go to the New Testament, you're going to see that the two people walking on the road to Emmaus were husband and wife, because Clopas, it says his wife was at the cross, but then later it doesn't mention her. It mentions him. See, that's what we're talking about with the females, but it mentions him later, that he and his companion were walking, but then it mentions her at the cross. His wife was at the cross, so we know it's them two walking back home to Emmaus. Anyway, so and then his name is in two different places. One it's Clopas, the other is at Cleopas. Okay, anyway, so here in verse 28 it says, and is this man Coniah, which is Jeconiah? Okay, so everybody knows this is referring to the same person in the genealogy. Okay, Coniah is Jeconiah. Okay, is this man Coniah a despised, broken idol, a vessel in which is no pleasure? Why are they cast out, he and his descendants, and cast into a land which they do not know? O earth, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, write this man down as childless, a man who shall not prosper in his days, for none of his descendants shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. See, so on the surface, that poses a problem for Christ, right? Because he is in the genealogy of Christ. And it says he can't sit on the throne. And the Lord's saying that. However, so here's the key. This is how good God is. However, he is in the line, the genealogy of Joseph, the royal line, not the bloodline. And since Jesus is adopted, he still qualifies to be the king. He's not in the bloodline of Joseph, so this Jeconiah does not apply to Jesus. Is that understood? But you got questions? If he was in the bloodline, Christ wouldn't qualify. If it came through Mary's, if Jeconiah was in Mary's bloodline, he wouldn't qualify. It was through the blood, right? Through the bloodline. But because he's over in Joseph's It's in Joseph's bloodline, and Jesus isn't from the blood of Joseph. He's adopted. It doesn't cancel him out from sitting on the throne. Okay, does that make sense? So see how that's how good God is, how perfect God is in the way he does things. Even when there's, things that take place, God still knows all. And he works the things out. Okay, questions? Anybody got any questions? Pretty good with that? Okay, so just, well, where are we at? We're doing pretty good. Maybe we could start in chapter 5. All right. So just wanted to kind of cover those two genealogies. One we know is from Joseph. The other is from Mary. They have two different, we know that because there's two different sons from David, right? One's Solomon, one's Nathan. So clearly those are two different lines. So one has to be Joseph's, one has to be Mary's. Can't say they're both Joseph's because Joseph didn't come from two different, people. Clearly have Solomon, which is David's son, and you clearly have Nathan, which is David's son. And then those two lines come down, and they both, come to Jesus. So clearly there's two different genealogies there, right? So one has to be Joseph's, which it clearly says. Then it says, as was supposed, that has to be Mary's because he's the son-in-law. And so it's actually, mentioning Joseph, who was the father of Jesus, as was supposed the son of, which is the father-in-law, which goes up to Nathan. Okay, everybody got me? Hope I explained that easy enough. Right? Kind of hot in here, huh? Yeah, so we see the two genealogies, and so one is a bloodline, one's a royal line, and so both of them come to Jesus, right? So Jesus is qualified through the royal line, through the bloodline, to be king. Okay, that's going to be important when we get into chapter 5 of Revelation, where it talks about the Lamb taking the scroll. We know Jesus is the Lamb, but I just kind of wanted to go through this again one more time. If people haven't seen it, because it's important, you can go read this to yourself, but when you get home, but, look through this, and you see there's definitely two different genealogies. One is royal, one is blood, and when you go through that, Jesus qualifies on both parts to be king. Right? And when God's told Solomon or David that your kingdom, is going to be forever, well, then we know now it applies to Christ, whose kingdom is forever. Right? All right. Questions? That was kind of short and simple, right? Which I have 7 pages here. I thought it was going to be a lot longer. What do you got? Any questions? All right, does everybody understand? I want to make sure. If you got a question, there is no dumb question. Because if you don't ask, right, you're probably thinking of something, and probably there's 3 or 4 other people thinking of the exact same thing. But if everybody doesn't ask it, then nobody gets the answer. Right? Anybody got any questions? Well, Adam through Nathan, Nathan through Adam, all the way down. I mean, both of them come through Adam, but in Matthew, they're basically, he's addressing the Jews. So they're basically, that Jesus is king of the Jews even, which the Jews didn't get. So he's still king of the Jews because it basically goes up to Abraham, who they consider their father, right? So it's proving that Jesus is even king of the Jews, which they reject still, right? And then, going back to Adam, so, Solomon is in that line, right? And then Nathan is in the line of still David, but all the way up to Adam. Which basically proves that Jesus is king of all. Okay? The whole world. Everything. So, does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Going once? One twice. Comments? Anybody got any comments? Nobody got any comments? Really? All this? Well, I just want you to get it. There is a split. You got Solomon and you got Nathan, right? You know, Solomon was the king. And so that's the royal line, right? It comes down. His kingdom will be established forever, right? But then you have Nathan, the other brother, the brother of Solomon, who wasn't a king, but yet then he's got a line which comes down. We see that through Mary. That's the bloodline, right? So I mean, so yeah, definitely there's two different genealogies. Yeah, yeah, they both come from Adam, but it's addressing Abraham because it's dealing with just the Jews. It's proving that Jesus is King of the Jews. That's why it goes to Abraham. Then over in Luke, it goes all the way from, you know, up to Adam, which basically covers the entire world, right? So all of us are descendants of Adam, right? Even the Gentile, right? The Gentiles are descendants of Adam through Nathan, and then the Jews are descendants of Abraham. Well, from Adam too, but so that's covering Abraham, which is the Jews, and then Luke is covering all the way to Adam, which covers the entire world. So Jesus is king of the Jews and the world. So he qualifies on both ends, the royal line and the bloodline, to be the king. Okay? And so I just kind of want to point out the Jeconiah thing because to me, it hit me like bricks. Like, wow, that's how God is. It's like he's adopted, so he's not within the bloodline of where God cursed him, said he would never be on the throne again, or his descendants would never be on the throne. And God made a way out through the bloodline. And so it's amazing to see that, you know, how God works, right? It's in Jeremiah chapter 28. It shows, well, it says Caniah, but it's the same person. Jeconiah and Caniah, they're the same person. Yep.
I've heard that there's no word tragedy. So if it's something awful, it just hasn't got hit yet. Just
Yeah.
God's not through yet.
Oh.
So it doesn't make sense. It makes it.
Yeah. And so I encourage you to go back and kind of just read these scriptures and write them down and go back and do study on them. You know, if you got a study Bible, do some research on them and kind of go through here and see what, and you look at yourself and, you know, right now it's kind of like, you know, but go back and read over them, read about Jeconiah, read about the two genealogies and put, you know, different things together. And you can see that there, you know, the genealogies, there's people just like us. You got Tamar, right? She's in the, you know, you have Rahab. She's a prostitute. She's in the genealogy of Christ, right? You have Bathsheba. She's in the genealogy of Christ. She was David's great-grandmother, right? Then you have Boaz, who married a Midianite, Ruth. So that was, so their child was, what do you call it? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a pure Jew. It was like a Samaritan, right? So, you know, look at, you know, when you study this stuff, it's amazing to see that, you know, God's no respecter of persons. If those, you know, follow him and obey, then he can use you no matter what, right? So that's important to see that the people that he used throughout history. Think about that. Rahab, because she hid the spies, she was protected. And then she believed in, you know, and she became basically a Jew, and she married Perez or one of those back there, and because what she did, and she was from Jericho, right? So she's in the lineage of Christ, and she's a Gentile. I mean, you think of that stuff, it's like, yeah, God, he's not a respecter of person. It's not, you know, it's not all about the Jews. God can use anybody, even if they were a prostitute. She was. Yet somebody was blessed to marry her, and she was blessed to be in the lineage of Christ, right? So God didn't hold that person at fault or, anything against them for marrying her. She's in the blood, in the genealogy, right? So it's amazing to see, the Bible. It's just awesome. All right. Yes. Good switching. Oh, because depending on the author, you might, of course, Jeremiah, of course, that was way back, so maybe, at time, or whatever, in the original manuscripts, it's like Caniah, and then maybe his name was Jeconiah, and so, but it's the same person. So you could have different, the different authors, right? For Jeconiah. Yeah, right. Kind of like Robert, right? Or Richard, yeah. Richard and Dick. Ron. I didn't say it, but I don't know if his name's just Ron or if it's, short for Ronald, Ronnie. Or you got Robert and Rob, So anyway, yeah, short as that's point. So yeah. All right. Anybody else? Because we're going to wrap this up because we're going to get into chapter 5 next week. And that's going to be a good chapter because it's the Lamb takes the scroll. We just ended with chapter 4, right? About the praise at the end. And now we're getting into chapter 5 about the Lamb, who is worthy to take the scroll. Yes. Did she have to what? Well, the whole family, yeah. I mean, by then, but that was Rome. So by then, Rome probably wanted to count everybody because of taxes, right? So of course they want every person counted. Yeah. So, all right. Anybody else? No. All right. Let's wrap up. Close out in prayer then. Lord, we love you, God. You're just amazing, wonderful.